Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third installment of my series on data manipulation and data analysis using R. So, these are the topics that I want to cover in this video. So, the main thing I want to do is first talk about data objects and types using the str function, and then creating and referencing a column slash field in your dataset using the $sign. All right. And if we have a little more time, we may have another topic on the docket, but we'll see how far we get here. Okay, so if you missed my last lesson, basically what we covered was, as you can see here, using packages, uh, external packages that I download from the internet and from our little install feature here. So in this case, we installed the psych package and we used the describe function that comes with that. We also talked a little bit about, various arguments and whatnot you can enter into these functions here, like read CSV. So we added this NA strings value here. But what I do want to talk about, as I mentioned, is data types and objects. So if you've taken a stats class before, one of the things that was probably covered early on, or at least hopefully was covered early on, is how there's different types of data. So there's things like what they refer to as nominal data, which is basically you can think of as a category. So like is something red, is something blue, things of that nature. We also have other types of data like ordinal. Maybe there's some type of order that's important with a certain data set. So for instance, if you're thinking about a placement in like a foot race, if someone got third place versus someone who got first place. So those are just a few data types, and that's commonly talked about in statistics. But in programming and coding languages, there's also various data types and objects as well. And similar to statistics, depending on the type of data that you have, will impact or influence the type of operations you can perform on them. So what I want to do real quick is actually bring up a website that has some pretty good descriptions of the various data types. That's this tutorialspoint.com website here that I found, and it has a nice breakdown of some of the different types of data. And I won't go into much detail here. You can look at this website or just, search for some other data types on your own, but I do want to call out a few. So basically, one data type is what's known as logical. So if something is true or false, this probably doesn't, explain too much right now, but that is one data type. The main ones I want to talk about are right now are numeric, n/integer. So as as you'd probably suspect, a numeric data type is basically a number. The numeric has a decimal. That's the main difference here between an integer. So you can see here that they're creating an object called v, and they're assigning the number 23.5, and then they're printing out or just basically saying, hey, give me the data type here, and that's what's being called with this class function, and then says, hey, it's a numeric. And then we also have the integer here. So as you may know, integers are, basically numbers that are not that aren't decimals, that aren't fractions, they're whole numbers. So you can see this is just 2 or 34 or 0, and I don't worry too much about the L right now, but basically that's what an integer is. And then the next one I want to get to is a character. So these are, as you can kind of see, values that typically will go in quotes, and you can kind of think of them as letters. Um, Generally speaking, at least for now, you can think of them as letters as opposed to something that's a number. But there are some um, uh, exceptions to this rule, but that's kind of the idea. So the reason why this is important is because the type of data that you have can influence the type, as I mentioned previously, the type of operations that you can run on them. So let's do some quick calculations in R here. So at its very, very basic level, R is actually, you can use it as a calculator. So let's actually clear this little space here. Um, and that's actually done with Control L, just if you were curious, if you want to clean up the little space. It doesn't actually affect anything that was run previously. It just makes this little cleaner. So anyway, so let's say, for instance, we want to do a basic operation like 4 plus 5, right? And we enter that in, and then we can see that R gives us the lovely 9 as the output. And of course, these are our numbers. So if we were to, let's just borrow from this little code here. So if we're just taking the class, and we want to get rid of that, what is the class of 5? And we can see that's numeric, even though there's no int. This is an integer, which is interesting. Anyway, the main thing I want to get at is that this value is a number. So let's say, for instance, we try to do something like this, potato plus potato. Potato. Okay, this is a pretty, silly example, but obviously this, R doesn't like this, what we're trying to do here, because we're trying to add the word potato to the word potato, and it's saying, hey, these values are numbers, we can't add them up. So that's the obvious issue here. So as I mentioned earlier, characters are typically, you can think of them as letters, and the operations that can use with them aren't, associated with numbers. But you can actually wrap a number around in quotes, and that'll actually turn it into a character. And what we previously did was we added, 4 plus 5, but if we try it again, quote 5 plus 4, it's actually going to give us that same error because it says, hey, you're trying to add a character data type with a numeric or integer data type, and that's not cool. It's not liking that. Again, so this is obviously a pretty simple example, but it does convey a pretty important concept, is that the data type that you have will dictate the type of operations that you can perform on them, as well as the type of values that are returned when you run specific operations. So one of the things I want to introduce quickly is a feature or a function in R known as, or typed in as str. And as you can see, that RStudio gives us a lovely little description here of what str does. But basically, I like to think of str as what's the general structure, or what's the general lay of the land of our data here. So what we will do, so as I mentioned previously, we can do a little help if we want to here with a question mark, but it's pretty simple, straightforward. All you do is you do str, and then you do parentheses, and then you supply it some type of object here that you want information on. So in this case, I'm going to ask for example data 2. And then the autocomplete. Whoa, let's try that again. No, didn't like that one. I did not type that properly. Here we go. Boom. So we have a very quick summary of our data set. And what it typically does is when you give the str, that structure function here, is that it lists each column value or the name of each column, and then it tells you what type of data it is, as well as some various information on it. So the first thing to note is that it is reading in our unique ID column as integer. And if we were just to simply look at our column again, our unique ID, we do pretty much have integers here. But then it's noting something interesting about these other two columns here, the name and occupation. And it's listing them as what's known as factors here. I won't get into much detail into that at this point, but just know that they are important when you do things like predictive modeling, like if you build some type of regression model or any type of predictive model, the factor is quite important when that's being done. But for now, just know that this is how it's reading in these characters as factors. You can see that it says there's 3 levels here for this name column, and by 3 levels, it basically means there's 3 unique values. So, we have John Smith, we have Jane Smith, and then we have John Adams. So these are all different values here. So if we add, for instance, maybe another row that said like 104 here and then John Smith exactly, it would still list 3 levels because those are the 3 unique values that we have for that column. And then for occupation here, we can see that we have 2. We have just the carpenter and the engineer, and then we have, a missing value here for John Adams. So there's only 2 levels here for the occupation. So the structure function is something that I like to do pretty much with any data set when at least when I'm initially working with it, just to get a quick idea of what type of data that I have in each column. So the str data is quite an important function. All right, cool. So now that we have a brief intro into the data types, what I want to do now is talk about how to create and reference a column in R using the $sign. So thus far, we haven't actually used or we haven't created a column in our practice, and we haven't explicitly referenced one either, an existing one. So that's what we're going to do now. And so the general syntax or way to do this is to type out the object that you're referring to. In this case, we want to refer to, let's just go back to example data 1. And that is going to be preceded by the $sign. And you can see right off the bat that R knows that, hey, you're probably trying to reference a specific column in a data set, aren't you? And it's already trying to autocomplete for us if we want. So we have the unique ID, the name, the occupation, and that's how these column names can be referenced. So if we actually just run this, you can see at the bottom it returns our unique IDs that we have in our data. So we'd have the 1 and 2, the 101, 102, and then 103, right? And then we can do the same with the other columns if you want. So that's okay. Let's get the names, and then it lists the names here. So that's kind of the quick way to reference one of the columns by name in your data. But this can also be used to create a new column in your data set. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to create, let's say something silly here, just the number 85. So we'll actually create a column in our data set called the number 85. And just as we did up here, when we create an object, we need to use this little arrow sign. All right, so what we're going to do is just assign it that number, 85, just as we said. So we'll go ahead and run this code. And if we examine our data, we look at example data, we have a new column. And just as we specified, we gave it an 85. So really simple and straightforward, right? That's just how you create a column in your data set. And if you want to give it that one value, 85, that's how you do it. Let's say we want to do something else. Let's do something like favorite hobby. And you can notice what I've been doing is I've been separating the words with a dot, and that's kind of the norm when you create an object or kind of a data frame or a column in your data, is you separate the words generally by a dot or a period. So let's create a new column here, and let's say they're our favorite hobby. All of them just love baseball. So we ran our code here, and if we look at our data, we can see that now that we have the value baseball for everybody. So of course this is very simple, and probably the glaring question is, well, what if we actually want to give it specific values based off of maybe some information that's here? So we've given everyone 85, we've given everyone baseball, but what if we say, we want to, John Smith's favorite hobby is actually baseball, sure, but Jane Smith's is actually basketball, and maybe John Adams likes, I don't know, racquetball or something like that, So obviously that's something that's important. That you'll likely want to do is just be able to give people unique values based off of something else, but that will be actually covered in a separate video, as I want to keep these videos fairly short and just kind of run it or just leave it as it is. Yeah, so basically two basic things that we covered in this video was data types, um, and how to get the summary of your data using the str function. So we can think of that as structure, and that gives us a great little output here of our data. And then also how to not only create new columns in our data set, but to actually reference existing ones as well using the dollar sign. So um, I know this is, again, very high level and very intro, but in our next video, we'll get into a little more, a little more, slightly more complicated stuff. Not really that much more complicated, but we'll be talking about how to assign people values using other methods. Instead of simply just giving them all one value, we can give them some type of condition if we want. But yeah, so I hope this was informative, and I hope you will join us in our fourth installment.